6.1 FM. It's the perfect way to spice up your midweek routine and get answers to all your burning questions. Whether you're looking for relationship advice or curious about the art of intimacy, Roma's got you covered. Pleasure Pulse, every Tuesday night from 8 to 9 p.m. Only on Television Radio 96.1 FM. Don't miss your sex education journey starts this Tuesday with Roma as your guide.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Pleasure Pulse. I'm your host, Roma Richardson, and I'm so happy to have you here with me for another conversation on a sex-related topic. And tonight, we are getting into something very, should I say spicy? Spicy, contentious, very social and cultural. You know, a lot of these conversations that we have around sex are actually very connected to and rooted in our social and cultural ideas around the topic. So sometimes they ain't even about like what the bodies do. Sometimes they ain't even about like the actual, rarely is it ever about the mechanics of sex. Usually it is about the conversations around sex, the perceptions, the beliefs, the values, the norms around sex. So anyways, as usual, though, before we get started, I like to take a short break so you can let everybody know that Pleasure Pulse is live. So we will do that, come back, and then get into tonight's conversation. So stay tuned.
It's time that we realize that we must work together to thrive as we know it, the sky and below it. Could I never have more wonder, yeah, with life and all you see and the climate's changing. But hope is remaining. And we can't ignore the future, it depends on you and me. One chance, all that we got. One voice, together we start. Take care, the world where we live. Permite a todos vivir. Tomamos la oportunidad para guardar la humanidad. Andamos moving behind because we are. One climate, one Caribbean.
This message is brought to you by the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center under the EU GCCA Plus project, funded by the European Union.
Welcome back to Pleasure Pulse. I'm your host, Roma Richardson, and you're tuned in on ZIZ on Facebook, YouTube, and Radio 96.1 FM. And tonight we're going to be talking about the orgasm gap. So, the orgasm gap. Perhaps that is something new to some folks. I was trying to remember if I have mentioned it before, possibly, probably. But tonight I want to get deep into the orgasm gap. Well, as deep as we can get in an hour. So, before I talk about the orgasm gap, of course, we'll talk about what orgasm is. Orgasm, as we like to call it, coming, and not just we as in St. Kitts and Nevis, it is called that. A lot of places are referred to as that. A lot of places outside of St. Kitts, Nevis. So, orgasm is a psychophysiological response to sexual stimulation. It involves muscle contractions, hormonal changes, changes and tension release, which is why some folks will say they like to have an orgasm before bed, or sometimes people have an orgasm before work. Sometimes you have an orgasm before a big meeting or something that is kind of collecting a lot of tension, a lot of energy in some places, and you want a release. So that is where orgasm comes in for quite a number of people. Now, orgasm isn't necessarily essential for sexual pleasure, as in you can still enjoy sexual activities without orgasm, but orgasm is frequently sought in both solitary or solo and partnered sexual activities. So even though it is not essential for sexual pleasure, some people like to receive or reach orgasm, and some people look forward to it, seek it out, have certain sexual activity or sexual connection, engagement, so that they can reach orgasm. So it might not be essential, but it is often, sought after. So what is the orgasm gap? So if we say orgasm is this psychophysiological response, as in it's a response that happens in our bodies, but also in our the parts of our bodies that are connected to our brain, are connected to psychology and so on, because it does something for us beyond the physical release. It does something for us hormonally. It does something for us when it comes to our emotions, and certain types of happy hormones that might be released. So when it comes to the orgasm gap, though, that is, and I'm going to be referencing for, I think, the first time in a long time, or the first time in forever, research and statistics, right? So the orgasm gap is a persistent average difference in the frequency of orgasm for heterosexual men and women who have sex. And this is a definition by Lisa Wade, a researcher. So it is an average difference in how much heterosexual men and women report that they orgasm or come. And the thing with the gap is that it is a persistent gap. So, and I'll go into this later, but it kind of crosses societies, it crosses age, and it's not restricted to a very, specific group of people in a very specific place. You kind of find the gap showing up in a lot of different spaces. So, in terms of what the gap actually is in numbers, generally it's about 95% of men versus 65% of men who report that they always orgasm during sex. So that's about a 30% difference. In a 2019 study, and that first data point that I gave you is what kind of exists currently, and what the current research shows. A 2019 study found that 82% of men reported orgasming during their most recent casual sexual encounter, compared with only 32% of women. So depending on who you talk to, those numbers, or how big your sample sizes are, those numbers vary. So we're looking at 65% of women to 65% of women to 95% of men, or in other instances 32% of women to 82% of men. And as I mentioned, we're talking about heterosexual men and women who have sex with each other, right? So we're not talking about men who have sex with men. We're not talking about women who have sex with women. Here we're talking about heterosexual men and women. So this conversation is also very specific. If you're a woman who has sex with women, you ain't really have to worry because the data is on your side. If you're a man who has sex with men, also, the differences in experiences of orgasm are not as big as they are for heterosexual people. In a 2024 study, they found that the orgasm gap persists across all age groups. So whether you are looking at younger people in their 20s or older people in their 50s and 60s, you still find that difference in reported orgasms, right? All of the data, remember I said, lesbians, women who have sex with women, the data is on your side. All of the data show that women who have sex with women have a higher and more equal frequency of orgasms. And this might partly be because lesbian women are more likely to engage in and receive oral sex, with encounters lasting longer often than those of heterosexual women. In other words, when lesbian women have oral sex, the oral sex tends to last longer than the oral sex that happens in heterosexual encounters that men are performing on women. So there's that. Now, some weeks ago, and in different conversations, this came up, the issue of what sex is, like in real life, like what is sex? And we kind of discussed how very personal and individual the definition and experience can be. And one guest of mine said that for her, sex didn't happen, so it wasn't sex if she didn't orgasm. And we also know that the absence of orgasm can cause distress and relationship challenges for some folks. So orgasm can seem like a very frivolous topic to talk about at times, but for some folks it's very serious, especially if in relationships where there are heterosexual people, there are constant fingers pointed to this gap, or there is constant recognition that that gap exists in the relationship. That is, that the people who are having sex, especially the woman, is very much aware that however many times out of 10, her partner is able to orgasm, but she is not. So it can cause distress and relationship challenges. Also because a lot of people, like my guest, some weeks ago, defined sex by our ability to orgasm from it. So if that is odd, and define not just sex, but pleasure as well. So if that is how we define sex and that's how we define pleasure, if it doesn't happen, then the reality or the occurrence of sex and the consideration of it as pleasure, or the, including it as a pleasurable act, kind of come into question if that doesn't happen. And for some people, and it's a curious thing, right? Because for some folks, orgasming is less important than other things. Like they're able to fully experience the activity, whatever the activity is, without needing orgasm to be that climax. that end, we also call it orgasmic climax. So what are some of the things that cause this orgasm gap? So we can file the factors that contribute to the orgasm gap under a number of different areas or categories. One is the socio-cultural factors that surround orgasming. Another one is anatomical factors or physiological factors. Another thing is media influence. Another thing is communication. Another thing is psychological barriers like insecurities. I'm going to go into some of them, and I encourage you to think about others that, especially if you are someone who has experienced, that feeling of not, or that sense that your orgasms occur less frequently than your partners if you're in a heterosexual relationship, because it only applies to heterosexual relationships. If you're in another type of relationship and there's a difference in frequency of orgasms for all partners, then it's something else, not the orgasm gap, because the orgasm gap is specific to heterosexual couples. So, which doesn't mean that, your concerns aren't valid, but there are different factors that are contributing to it, and probably also it requires a different kind of conversation to be able to address or redress that situation. So, like I said, there are sociocultural factors, anatomical, media influences, communication, psychological barriers that all can contribute, that all do contribute to the orgasm gap. So, Lisa Wade, who I quoted earlier, the researcher into orgasms, said very importantly that, and I think we all can kind of admit that there is a societal belief that women's role in sex is to provide the conditions necessary for men to experience pleasure. So women exist to ensure that men can feel, derive, experience pleasure from sexual activity. But the reverse isn't true. So men don't exist to ensure and enhance women's sexual pleasure. So men's pleasure is also privileged or prioritized over women's pleasure. And women are, as I mentioned, present to ensure men experience pleasure, but also sexual scripts, so the things that we learn about sex based on our gender, based on other factors, those scripts, the messages that we receive, suggest that penile insertion is necessary, and that penile insertion, penetration, whatever you want to call it, that almost always guarantees a man's sexual release, but it does not equally guarantee a woman's sexual release. So that's a whole other thing. Men are able to orgasm from the act of, just the movement alone is enough for a lot of men to experience pleasure in the form of an orgasm. But for people with vaginas and people with vulvas, that is sometimes not enough. So some people with vaginas, some women are able to experience orgasm just from insertion or penetration, but some require other types of stimulation to reach that point of orgasm. And in addition to all of that, in addition to as evidence of how men's pleasure is privileged or prioritized over women's, men's orgasms are often seen as the end of sex. So when a man comes, when a man climaxes, everything stop, dolly house lock. And that happens in real life and in porn. So how many women's orgasms have you seen in porn? That's a question to you. That's a question for you. If you are a porn consumer, porn watcher, which is one of the places where we see a lot of the sexual activity outside of our own, especially if you're not into voyeurism and, you don't watch other people that you know or that you don't know, but in person have sex. Porn is one of those places that we see the sexual activity taking place, especially insertive sex. How many women's orgasms have you seen in porn? Compare that to the number of men's orgasms that you've seen in porn. The fact that there are entire categories dedicated to men orgasming on camera, orgasming on the women that they are, the other people that they're having sex with. You don't usually see women's orgasms happening like that. And usually in porn too, when the man orgasms, that's the end of the scene. The video is finished and then you move on to something else. So even media, represents sex and men's participation in sex as not just key, but as an indicator of when sex starts and ends. So because of this emphasis on and focus on penis in vagina or insertive sex, which I kind of referenced earlier, how there is that, how sexual scripts demand and focus on center around penile insertion. Because of that emphasis, other pleasure organs that assist in or are key in orgasms are forgotten or neglected, like the clitoris. So some people, as I mentioned, their penis in vagina or insertive sex is not the thing, or maybe isn't always the thing. So it could be isn't ever or isn't always the thing that helps them to reach a climax or reach orgasm. And I should say orgasm and not climax. Because climax sound like after you reach up there, you're coming back down. But yeah. So let's say orgasm. So clitorises, they are there kind of for a huge contributor to pleasure, right? Unlike other parts of the body, and we do have other pleasure organs. There are, like, there's the skin, for example. There are other parts of your body, depending on who you're talking to and who you're dealing with, that can help them to experience different degrees of pleasure, right? But for some people, the clitoris is the thing that will help them to achieve a clitoral orgasm. So when they're having insertive sex and they want to orgasm, the clitoris is something that will have to be involved for them for that to happen. So for some people, that is where, a lot of their pleasure emphasis will lie. So I've given you a bit kind of to meditate on so far. I've shared the definition of orgasm. We started talking about the orgasm gap, and I shared some data with you, as well as the fact that this is something that persists across all ages, and that there are a number of things that contribute to the orgasm gap. So the ideas around whose role in sex is prioritized or privileged, who's there to ensure or enhance whoever's pleasure, the insistence on penile insertion and the insistence and emphasis on penile insertion as like the sex, and what media and porn tell us about when sex ends, as well as the kind of neglecting, unfortunately, of the clitoris for people who want that kind of stimulation. So we're going to take a short break here. Think about that so far. Think about any other causes that come to mind for you, especially, as I mentioned, if you're somebody who has recognized that gap, maybe in your own life or with people that you know. Think about that so long, and then we'll come back and continue the conversation. So stay tuned. Welcome back to Pleasure Pulse. Tonight we're talking about orgasms and the orgasm gap. So, the orgasm gap, as I mentioned, is a persistent average difference in the frequency of orgasm for heterosexual men and women who have sex with each other. So, it is only something that exists, occurs in this way for heterosexual men and women. So, everybody else, you're doing a good I think it's important to mention here, as I did earlier, and to remind everyone that orgasm doesn't have to be the end all be all. For some people, it is, and that's okay. And this conversation is especially geared towards the folks who are not experiencing the levels of orgasm that they, or the frequency of orgasm that they desire. And if you want more, that's also okay. I think in any situation, it's important to think about why it is we want a particular thing. And that's just to ensure that the reasons that we want them align with what our values are, with what our beliefs are, with what our ways of seeing the world right? And not that someone else told us, or porn told us, that we should be having orgasms, or some other website or something said that if you're not having 3 orgasms a day, then you're not having enough. Like all of those need to be tempered with our own realities, our own desires. Because if you don't desire, like, truly something, you don't have to do it just because sources say, or other people say that you should do it, or that you should want it. If you do want it, there are ways to achieve it. And later on, I'll get into some of those ways. I should have said that this show will probably be a shorter episode, but let's see. So far we've talked about the causes of the orgasm gap. I've shared some definition and background around the gap. Now I want to go into some other factors that can contribute to the orgasm gap. And some of these are based on some research that I did, research that I've read. So for some people, and this also connects back to the point about men's pleasure being prioritized or privileged over women's pleasure, and how life can interfere with or get kind of entangled with all of that. How sex happens in real life versus, in porn and so on. Because in real life, sex is very different to porn sex. In real life sex, you might not have all day to get the perfect shot. You probably don't, right? You're dealing with, or you might be dealing with children, you're dealing with work, you're dealing with responsibilities elsewhere, you're dealing with all of the social clubs and associations that you're part of. You had to go to church, you had to go see your mother or your father, or you're dealing with lots. You had to shop for your friends, you're dealing with lots of things, right? So not only is there that time consideration, there's also that mind consideration. So what happens, in real life, and I found this from the research that I did, is when we're talking about orgasms and the orgasm gap, and so we realize that life is still happening through all of that, right? So sometimes the orgasm gap shows up because women who are often tasked with taking care of the homes, taking care of their partners, taking on a majority of certain kinds of labor at work, when they're having sex, when they're preparing to have sex, when they're doing foreplay and all of these things, they might have to forsake their orgasm because of time, because of responsibilities, because of other things that, are competing or conflicting with the sex that they want to be having. So what I found in my research from one participant, they said that orgasm was very important to them, that orgasm represented kind of like the completion of the activity. Their partner, their husband, encouraged them to reach to the point of orgasm, so they supported it in whatever way that they could, but they hurried their partner to finish or to orgasm because they had other things to do. So the dishes in the sink, is coming up to 7 o'clock, and 7 o'clock is when I have to go do XYZ, blah, blah, blah. So people like actually, encouraged it, told their partners like it was okay to orgasm. Let's forget mine, because, they're under the impression that, okay, the woman's orgasm will take longer than the man's, which is not necessarily true, and I'll get to that later. But there was life that was getting involved in their ability to have sex and experience pleasure in the way that was important to them, in the way that they desired. So there is that reality of responsibility. And of course, whereas there are some times where the education, the knowledge are low in terms of what might be required for a person with a vulva, a person with a vagina to reach orgasm, men aren't always ignorant towards women's pleasures. Like for many relationships, that is a kind of staple feature, and that is something that they inquire about, and that is something that they are interested in. For example, there are men who, when they're finished having sex with women, they will ask them, did you orgasm? Sometimes women have different responses, varying responses to the questions. Sometimes they believe that, nothing happened for that to happen. So men aren't always ignorant towards women's pleasure, but as I mentioned, sometimes women's multiple roles interfere with their ability to fully enjoy or experience it. And oftentimes, if people are short on time or they're competing, priorities, it is the women's orgasm that is sacrificed. And I mentioned this is sometimes because people believe that it will take longer. And I found some research that said that other than women who have sex with women, women who masturbate not only have greater numbers of orgasms, but they have orgasms in around the same time as men who masturbate. So that's a little myth busting there, the fact that women's orgasm will take up, or the thought that women's orgasm will take up the whole night, compared to the fact that in reality, it doesn't have to, like with good foreplay, with good preparation, with great stimulation, it can happen especially if, and we're talking about people who are pressed for time, because in the grand scheme of things, like what is long, we're not talking about situations where you are having sex, there are no competing priorities, and you're just like, I just don't feel like waiting. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about people who are interested. Everybody's interested in ensuring everybody experiences pleasure in ways that mean something to them, and everybody's collectively working towards that. So good thing to know that women who have orgasms, who masturbate and got orgasms from masturbation, got them in about the same time as men who masturbate. So there is a world in which quickies can also result in orgasms for women. Now, Queen's University in Canada, a research study from some of their researchers there, also found that sexual obstacles like not receiving adequate stimulation, difficulties inherent in having orgasms, like, for example, thoughts that they require too much, and not knowing, or let me leave it there. So sexual obstacles like not receiving adequate stimulation also contribute to this orgasm gap. And I mentioned, the clitoris earlier, and how for some people that is an absolutely necessary inclusion in achieving or reaching orgasm. And finally, another thing, at least that I found that contributes to the orgasm gap is sexual education. And here I am on Pleasure Pulse, helping everybody reach their reach orgasm. So sexual education actually can play a big role in pleasure and people's experiences of pleasure, and the things that people know that their bodies can do, and how to do those things. So a lot of our sexual education is, to be honest, inadequate. This sexual education that I received focused a lot on abstinence. So it didn't even try to talk about the differences like between penises and vaginas or anything like that. So whereas a lot of other sex education can be inadequate in that it only focuses on reproduction, mine was inadequate in that it mainly focused on abstinence. So we didn't even get to talk about reproduction really. But when sex education focuses almost exclusively or has that lens or underpinning of reproduction and abstinence, then you have cases where certain things are emphasized and other things de-emphasized. So any focus on reproduction will overemphasize male participation and pleasure, because the conversations tend to be about pregnancy prevention, which tends to be about preventing sperm from connecting with eggs. So it maybe inadvertently focuses on the participation of the penis of the male in that sexual activity if it is insertive sex. And like, for example, we sometimes, I didn't learn this in school, but you go online in different spaces when people are talking about condom use and putting on condoms. They have a cucumber or they have a dildo and they can demonstrate it on a penis. How often do they have a vulva to demonstrate the use of a female condom? Or how often do they talk about other ways that people with vaginas can protect themselves from pregnancy, from STIs, and so on? So the education that we receive often teaches a lot, maybe subconsciously, about penises and less on vulvas. And there are messages in sex education and otherwise that come through about kind of preparing boys for sex and encouraging boys to have sex messages. And when I say sex education here, I don't mean the formal sex education that we receive in school necessarily. I mean the education, the knowledge around sex that we receive in general outside of school, on the road or whatever. So messages that people receive, that we all receive, that encourage boys to have sex and girls to be afraid of it, that also contributes to the orgasm gap, because that encouragement and that discouragement kind of results in someone being not just eager to participate, but embodied in participating. So they're able to be a full participant in what they're doing because it is something that has been encouraged. It's something that has been told to them that they should not just do, but do a lot of. So boys receive messaging to encourage them to have sex, and girls receive messaging to encourage them to be afraid of sex, to occupy like by default submissive role or passive role rather in sex, and that does not contribute to a great sense of understanding of pleasure and of what sex is for a lot of people. And all of this, the sex education, the messages that we receive contribute to limited understandings of bodies and perceptions of pleasure. So if we don't learn about ourselves, because we ain't gonna know, I was watching on TikTok these videos like 2 days ago of toddlers learning how to jump. And they were hilarious, but a lot of the comments were like, somehow I thought they would just know how to do it. And that is funny to me because there are so many things that we think people will just know, just have knowledge around, just know how to do. But all of these things have to be taught. Like a lot of us are still learning how to have sex in our 40s, in our 50s, in our 60s, in our 30s, in our 20s. We are still learning as we grow. So the information that we provide to people, the information that is made accessible to them, because sometimes, we even control, not sometimes, we even control the information that our young people have access to online. And some of the information can be the missing piece in what they need to navigate their sexual relationships in healthy ways, right? So all of this, this limited and misfocused education around sex can contribute to how we understand our bodies and how we perceive pleasure, and can cause us to perceive pleasure in limited ways, or can cause us to conclude that pleasure is only for certain people and certain bodies and certain genders and not for all of us. Now, what is the way forward? So I've given you all some of the factors, a lot of the factors that contribute to the orgasm gap. And this is just me, sharing this information so that you can become aware of the many things that, as I mentioned at the top of the show, go into the kind of sex we have and how we experience sex and how we experience our not pleasure. So that is for you to, think about it some more, especially if, as I mentioned, a few times, you are someone who has recognized that there is a difference in the experience of orgasm between you and your partner, or among you and your partners. So the way forward, and this is something that I found in that same research that talked about the connection between or the impact of age on the orgasm gap. So remember when I said that there was a study that showed that the orgasm gap persisted across all ages? In that same study, they found that older women reported higher levels of sexual satisfaction compared with younger women, which suggests that sex may become more pleasurable with age, potentially leading to higher orgasm rates. But I want to also say here that it's not to say that younger women will not achieve orgasm or have to accept things as they are, or that they just have to wait till they get older. But it is to say that the fact that some women report these things, some women say that sex gets better or sex is good for them, at the age that they are, means that sex can be good for everybody. And all of the factors, except maybe a few, have to do with, and even those ones that have to do with, anatomy and so on, have to do with social ideas and social and sexual scripts. The ones that, the messaging that we receive, that heterosexual sex is just the penis gets erect and then you insert it in the vagina, and that's all there is to it. We receive a lot of messages that suggest that that is all that sex is. Is that really all that sex is for anybody? Sometimes that might be all that you have. You at least want, the vagina to be lubricated. There's lube, and so people have lots of different reasons to have different kinds of sex and different limitations like time, space, responsibilities and so on that might affect the kind of sex that you have, but that there is more, right? And there are ways that we can help everyone achieve the kind of pleasure that they desire. So it is possible for everyone. And here are a few ways that that can happen. One is open sexual communication. So talk about this. I've shared all of this information with you. Can you talk about it with your partner? Are you in a position to do that? Maybe you haven't thought about it before. Maybe it's not something that you experience. Can you talk about it with your friends? Can you talk about it with your peers? Men can talk about it with other men, and to see like kind of where everybody is at, what everybody is thinking, and how people are perceiving sex and perceiving pleasure. So open sexual communication can help to raise a lot of these issues and can also help you to find a path through them. Prioritizing foreplay and clitoral stimulation for those, of course, who like or desire it. So as I mentioned, if orgasm is something that you especially care about, then, like, don't feel like you have to care about it now that Roma tell you put the orgasm gap. Like, that's not what's happening here. But for those who like to have their clitoris stimulated, that could be a welcome change. And of course, that open sexual communication also comes in, because guidance and letting people know what kind of touch you like, how intense you like it, what kinds of movements you like, whether you want to incorporate, other things in the touch and in the intensity, and whether you want to affect it in some way. Like, all of those things can help you to get there if that's where you want to get. So there are also other things like sex toys and mutual exploration that can help you to find out what you like. So they can help you to explore. You might be a little new to the clitoris area. There are lots of people who are still discovering all of what their nether regions and their genitals include, what their genitals look like. It could be an opportunity for you and your partner or partners to do some investigation, some investigative work down there, right? That could be a great chance to help to share information and understandings for everybody, because we are best placed to let our partners know what we like. Sometimes our partners can touch us in some way or discover something that we didn't know was there, or discover a touch that we didn't know we liked. Like, that happens as well, and I encourage you to be open to that. But also, we can play a major role in helping to guide our partners in terms of what we like, what we don't like, and so on. And of course, pleasure-based sex education. So I mentioned how sex education can affect and can contribute to the orgasm gap. So the flip side of that is providing sex education, receiving sex education, seeking out sex education that is pleasure-based can help to shift some of the focus off of penises in vagina and that meaning the end-all of be-all of sex, and can focus on everybody involved and what it will take for them to experience a pleasurable situation, a pleasurable encounter, pleasurable sexual activity. So as I mentioned, open communication, open sexual communication, prioritization of foreplay and clitoral stimulation. So for example, not just spending, especially if you have the time, let me just say, increasing the amount of time that you spend on foreplay. And that will benefit everybody, because everybody is then better prepared for sex. This sex might also be the foreplay, right? Like the activity that you're doing, the center, the climax of that activity might be the foreplay. So you could just have a session of foreplay, a session without any kind of insertion, a session without, anything like that. So open sexual communication, prioritization of foreplay and clitoral stimulation, incorporating sex toys and starting small if you're new to sex toys, mutual exploration and pleasure-based sexual education or sexuality education. That's all I have for you. I hope that, the conversation on the orgasm gap doesn't feel daunting, but feels like an opportunity to reflect on what your experience of orgasms has been, what your relationship to pleasure is like, what you define pleasure as, how much you prioritize orgasm or not in your sexual activity, and what your partners might think about it. How you might move forward as somebody who desires to have more orgasms, more frequent orgasms, more regular orgasms, and what that might look like for you sexually. That might look like when we sit down to have sex, the foreplay includes, or the foreplay leads to an orgasm for the woman. That the first half of whatever it is you're doing is focused on that. It don't have to be so specific, but you know what I mean. Like intentional effort is put into ensuring that everybody experiences pleasure in the way that they define pleasure. It might also mean that when there's insertion or penetration, there's also clitoral stimulation. That could be a good way to help people, reach the point of orgasm. And who knows, you might reach it the same time and there's one big chaotic release. One big, release. Synergized all of those things. So I encourage you to continue thinking about orgasms and the orgasm gap, about pleasure in your own lives, and think about too the ways that you can experience pleasure, derive pleasure in non-sexual activity. That could help to bring you closer with orgasm, or it could help you to find a way to still experience the feeling, the emotions associated with pleasure, even if you're not able to reach the point of orgasm. So think about it in an expansive way and don't put a restriction on the things that are available or the things that you think are available to you. So I will wish you a pleasurable evening here. Remind you that this is a space where no topic or question is too big or too small. So if you see me on the road and you have a question about the orgasm gap or something else comes to mind, feel free to share it with me. But I will say good night here and have you take care of yourself and maybe reach an orgasm or not. But have fun and help yourself experience pleasure. Good night.